The following is a retelling of some of the most daring, bold-faced lies ever told. Prepare to be thrilled and amazed at the exploits of Count Victor Lustig. On March 31st, 1889, construction was completed on the Eiffel Tower in Paris, France. It stands on the Champ de Mars. It is over 300 meters tall and weighs over 10,000 metric tons. Some 2.5 million rivets went into the construction. The metal frame itself weighs 7,300 metric tons. It was built to inaugurate the 1889 World's Fair, and when it was built, many Parisians and Frenchmen hated the metal monstrosity. They felt it didn't match other Parisian landmarks like the Arc of Triumph or the Notre Dame Cathedral. They've come around in time, of course, but in May of 1925, it was sold for scrap. This is a true story.
Find that laptop, guys. Okay, that's the laptop. Good job. Enter the password and access the files. Great job. It's got all the info on where the money's hidden.
The 5 most successful French scrap metal dealers were invited to an official, confidential business meeting. Nothing was said specifically, but the invitation came on official stationery from the Ministry of Post and Telegraphs. The meeting would take place at the Hôtel de Crillon, which was and still is one of the most exclusive, luxurious hotels in all of Paris, which in 1925 put it up there with one of the fanciest hotels in all the world. At the meeting, these 5 men who had been summoned in secrecy were ushered into one of the suites on the top floor. They were met with the Director General of the Ministry of Post and Telegraphs himself, one Monsieur Lustig.
You got the first sash. Keep looking. Throw the bags into the sea. You can pick them up when you leave.
Monsieur Lustig explained to the 5 industrialist businessmen that they were there for a bidding war. The reason for the secrecy, he said, was that the French government was planning on demolishing the Eiffel Tower. Lustig told them of the massive cost it would be to repair and maintain the structure, as some in the millions, when so many Parisians considered it to be a blight on the landscape anyway. In fact, popular local opinion, Lustig explained, was that the tower should just go. He then gave them the official figures, how 10,000 metric tons of good steel could be turned for profit. After drinks, the 6 men were chauffeured to the Eiffel Tower, where Director General Lustig flashed his badge and gained them access. Touring the Eiffel Tower, Lustig told them stories and anecdotes about the structure and its history. At the end of the tour, he thanked the 5 men and asked them to have their offers sent to his suite at the hotel within the space of the next 4 days.
Careful, there's a guard.
The winner of the bidding had offered 1 million francs, which, adjusted for inflation, comes out to near $15 million in 2020. The winner, a man named André Poisson, was summoned back to the suite at the Hôtel de Crillon and instructed to bring a check for 1/4 of the purchase price, 250,000 francs. In 2020 in US dollars, that's about 3.7 million. Not chump change by any means. When Poisson arrived back at the hotel, Director General Lustig hemmed and hawed a bit and hinted indirectly at his low salary as a lowly government official, and the scrap metal dealer realized Lustig had his hand out, asking for a bribe to finalize things. After greasing the Director General's palm with 50,000 francs to make sure Poisson's bid would be selected, and then 20,000 francs for Director General Lustig himself. The deal was signed. The check for 250,000 francs changed hands, and Poisson left, excited to go down in history as the man who would remove the Eiffel Tower. But as we all know, the Eiffel Tower still stands. Poisson made inquiries, of course, but there was no Director General Lustig at the Ministry of Post and Telegraphs. There were in fact no plans to demolish the Eiffel Tower at all. André Poisson never went to the police. He ate the monetary loss. He figured it would be better than the professional suicide it would be to be known worldwide as the man who fell for one of the most ballsy confidence scams in history. In December of 1925, a man nobody knew arrived at a luxurious hotel in Palm Beach, Florida, driven in a Rolls-Royce by a Japanese chauffeur. He received telegrams all around the clock, and when engaged in conversation, he was exceedingly brief yet polite. Sometimes he would tear the telegrams up without even looking at them. Who was this man? All people could find out about him was that he came from Europe, that he was a count no less, from an old and wealthy European family, and that his name was Count Victor Lustig. While at the hotel, Lustig approached one of the less distinguished guests and struck up a conversation. The man was Herman Lawler, a man who only had recently come into money as the head of an engineering company. The two became friendly, and eventually Lawler confided in the Count that while his business had done well for itself so far, there was trouble ahead for him. Money troubles. The Count, in confidence, replied back that he knew exactly how he felt. The Count told Lawler that his family's estate back home had been seized by the communists, and that he had no way of getting it back. He had, however, escaped with an item that had secured his future financially. It was then Count Lustig revealed to Lawler that he had in his possession a machine, one of a kind, made back home, that could produce money. He had used this machine and set himself up with a newfound enormous wealth, and in reality no longer had use of it. He even showed them the machine, a tiny mahogany box that smelled of chemicals. Lustig would enter a bill in one end, and two would appear on the other. The only downside was, it would take roughly 6 hours per bill. Lawler tried the machine. He went to the bank to have the new bill verified. The bank said it was the genuine article, and so he took the bait, hook, line, and sinker. Lawler persuaded the Count to part with this machine, and eventually, after much deliberation, the Count accepted his new friend's offer of $25,000, which in 2020 is in the area of $370,000. Count Victor Lustig disappeared from Palm Beach as quickly as he had arrived. Herman Lawler would report Count Victor Lustig to the police a year later and relate to them exactly how he had conned him out of 25 big ones using no more than a worthless box and some bills of cash. Victor Lustig, self-styled Count Victor Lustig, was born in Austria-Hungary on January 4th, 1890, and he would go on to be one of the most infamous con men the world had ever seen.
You could hide the bodies by throwing them into the sea at the back of the boat. Watch your background. Spare the civilians.
Everybody masturbate on the job sometime. You too. I fucking saw you.
He was fluent in several languages. He was a master of sleight of hand. He put on an air of mystery that made people extremely interested in this enigmatic man that was clearly affluent, but nobody could really understand what he was really all about. He created an image for himself that intrigued the kind of people he wanted to attract. He built it. They came. And then he fleeced them. He began his scams on the Atlantic ocean liners that ran back and forth between New York and Paris in the years before the First World War. He would concoct schemes like posing as a musical producer on Broadway, looking for investments for shows that would, of course, never see the light of day. World War I broke out and put a stop to the transatlantic crossings, however. In 1922, Lustig, using a fake name, contacted the American Savings Bank in Missouri and offered them $22,000 worth of World War I bonds to buy a farm with a plot of land. Lustig had no real interest in owning a ranch, but he offered the bank an additional $10,000 worth of bonds for cash to cover his expenses, so to speak. When the deal went down, Lustig employed his sleight of hand to swap envelopes around and left the bank holding nothing. He walked out with the bonds, the money, and the deeds. And if you think that's impressive, just wait.
Great, that's the last of them. Okay, now for the server room. That laptop you found earlier should enable me to give you access. Go back there and hook me up.
The bank, obviously, hired private detectives to track him down. They caught him. However, Lustig convinced them that if they were to press charges, the bank would suffer a major loss in confidence. In fact, not only should the bank drop their charges, they should pay him $1,000 to shut up and keep quiet. The bank paid.
Get me hooked up, and I'll get that door unlocked in just a few moments.
Lustig then went to Montreal. He paid someone to pick the pocket of a man named Linus Merton, a banker. Lustig showed up at his door with his wallet, having taken nothing from it. Lustig gained Merton's good graces, and the two became friendly. Then, Lustig confided in Merton that he had a cousin named Emil. Now, Emil worked at a bookmaker's.
Okay, guys, you're in. You'll need to overheat the secondary servers. Turning off the flow of coolant should do it.
Hey, Control. Just checking if you're awake. You doing okay there?
Turn off the valves at the bottom of the server rack.
And Emil, being a sneaky man, apparently, had a tap on a telegraph wire. This tap would allow him, and subsequently his good cousin Victor Lustig, to know the results of a race a full minute before they were announced.
It's okay, Control. Yeah, just changing the batteries. This radio's a piece of shit, you know?
The implication being they would be able to place a bet with the bookmakers after the race was over, knowing the results before the bookmakers did.
Got a body bag case here.
Merton was intrigued. Sadly, Lustig and his cousin Emil didn't have the money for any large investments, but Merton did, and Merton gave Victor $30,000 to place a bet with, which was the last Merton ever saw of Victor Lustig, or the money. Considering how the money had been intended for illegal purposes, there was no way Merton could contact the police, and by then, Lustig was on his way back to France. This is when he would enact his most famous con of selling the Eiffel Tower. In fact, Lustig tried the scam twice, but the second time one of the scrap merchants had contacted the police. Lustig, sensing his time in France was over for now, went back to America. Lustig would eventually settle into the counterfeit money business for real, but more on that in a bit. His Romanian money box scam was his most common scam. He would run it again and again, and he seemed to enjoy the challenge of who he scammed with it. In one instance, for example, he sold his money printing box to a Texas sheriff.
Watch the heat rise. Don't get that reboot.
In 1926, Victor Lustig would enact his potentially most risk-filled scam. He approached Chicago gangster Al Capone.
That should do it. They'll overheat now and cause that reboot.
Lustig convinced Capone that if the mob leader gave him $50,000, Lustig would be able to double it for him in 2 months' time. Stealing from Capone would be an obvious death sentence, something both men knew. Lustig, however, gave Capone his word.
Okay, now for overriding the main panel.
What Lustig did next, though, was take the money, place it in a safe, and leave it for 2 months, not doing anything with it but safeguarding it. He then returned to Capone and told him his scheme had failed, and gave Capone back the entire $50,000.
Just 2 more overrides. Should be about
Capone was taken aback, not used to honesty at all, especially from a con man. Lustig fell over himself apologizing. He had really tried hard to double the money after all, but now he was out of pocket himself on this. He eventually talked Capone into handing him $5,000 for having made an honest attempt at doubling his money for him. His argument being, having failed, he was at least upfront and honest about it and came clean, and the least Capone could do was tide him over until he got back on his feet. Of course, the $5,000 was what Lustig had been after all along. Imagine having the stones to scam Al Capone to his face. I guess that's why they call it Confidence Man. Some marks don't take too kindly to being cheated though. Some of them will come back and try and bite you in the ass. The sheriff Lustig scammed with his money box scheme. He dragged Lustig to Chicago and cornered him. The sheriff threatened Lustig. Lustig, however, did not lose his cool. He told the sheriff he must have not followed his instructions. He listed off a range of technical jargon, and eventually the mood changed. Lustig eventually suggested the sheriff get his money back. The sheriff agreed to leave if he got his money. So Lustig, being Lustig, gave the sheriff back his money, in counterfeit bills, and waited to leave town until the sheriff had been arrested for passing funny money. In 1930, Lustig teamed up with two Nebraska men, chemist Tom Shaw and pharmacist William Watts, and together they started producing counterfeit money wholesale. Shaw and Watts had engraved plates they could use to produce counterfeit bills in large quantities. Lustig had a network of readily available couriers to distribute the bills. Once the operation was up and running, they were putting out over $100,000 of monopoly money every month. The money, eventually nicknamed Lustig money, started turning up in gambling joints, banks and racetracks. Eventually it got so bad, the federal government took notice. As an aside, the United States Secret Service was originally created in 1865 to combat the rise of counterfeit currency being circulated at the time. In fact, the legislation that would create the agency was on President Abraham Lincoln's desk the night he went to the Ford Theater. The Secret Service didn't take over protection detail for US presidents until the assassination of President McKinley in 1901. In 1865, when it was founded, it was reported that as much as 1/3 of all US dollars in circulation were counterfeit. This is why the Secret Service was a branch of the Treasury Department all the while up to 2003, at which point they were transferred to the Department of Homeland Security. Which is how the Secret Service started looking into Lustig money, and how the Secret Service would eventually interview a certain arrested sheriff to get a physical description of one Count Victor Lustig. At the time, Lustig was involved with a woman named Billy May. When May learned that Lustig was also involved with chemist Tom Shaw's young mistress, she placed an anonymous phone call to the feds, which is how, on May 10, 1935, Count Victor Lustig was arrested on the streets of New York. When questioned, he immediately gave up his partners, but pretended ignorance on any involvement of his own. Among his personal effects, however, was a safety deposit box key. When asked about the key, Lustig just shook his head. The authorities found the box the key belonged to in the subway station at Times Square.
Sound control, I was just stretching my balls. You don't know what that means because you ain't got no balls, but that's okay.
In the deposit box, the lawman found $51,000 in funny money and the engraving plates with which they had been printed. Damning evidence, finally. So what was Lustig to do? The day before his trial, while held at the Federal House of Detention in New York, Lustig escaped. First, he feigned illness. Then, using a rope made of tight-together bed sheets, he opened a window and rappelled down the building. When he passed an office staffed with people, he would pretend to wash the windows with a piece of cloth. It worked. Nobody paid him any attention. As soon as he reached ground level, he legged it. On his pillow, in his cell, they even found a goodbye note. However, this is where the story of the illustrious Count reaches its end. In November of 1935, 27 days after his great escape, Lustig was picked up in Pittsburgh. This time, William Watts had already been arrested and delivered damning evidence by testifying against Lustig. Lustig, who had initially tried to plead not guilty, changed his plea to guilty. He copped to everything and received 15 years for his crimes, and they tacked on another 5 for his previous escape, and they stuck him in Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in the San Francisco Bay. 12 years into his sentence, on March 9, 1947, Lustig contracted pneumonia. He was transferred to the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. The self-styled Count passed away 2 days later, on March 11, 1947. We may never know his real name.